Uon, 14 hours. June 12, 1987, Kaliningrad. Radar node K83, the screens were alive. 14 targets fast, high, inbound, identified as likely American B-52s or F-111 strike formations, screaming in from the Baltic Sea. The radar display glowed with hard returns, stable vectors. Confirmed speed, altitude falling, all normal until it wasn't. Sergeant Volodin stood over the primary console, jaw clenched. Then the first anomaly target 7 flickered. It didn't jump. It didn't jam. It blurred its signal, spreading into static before vanishing altogether. Then another. Then all of them. In less than 4 seconds, every contact across the Kaliningrad grid collapsed into shapeless white noise. Not loss of signal. Not radar blackout. Worse, the system still received. Still processed, but there were no targets. Just violent, formless electronic chaos flooding the screen. Technicians screamed across the control floor. Reboot the discriminator, switch to auxiliary tracking. Bypass the main feed. Nothing returned. At 0116, 5 separate radar installations from Latvia to Belarus reported identical breakdowns. No missile impacts, no explosions, no signs of physical interference. But where radar saw order now, it saw only noise, not blinding. Worse, confusing. Volodin ran diagnostics. Power levels normal, frequency stable, no enemy jammers detected. The radar wasn't off. It simply no longer knew what it was seeing. Somewhere, out in the dark air above the Baltic, aircraft moved freely undetected, unreadable, untouchable, and in a command system that lived by its ability to track, classify, and kill threats before they reached the homeland. This was unthinkable. They weren't being jammed. They were being erased. At the Air Defense Headquarters near Chekhov, 60 kilometers outside Moscow. No one questioned the grid's infallibility. Soviet radar doctrine, refined since the 1950s, was built not just on power, but pride. Inside the hardened underground command room, giant screens lit with every pulse of the national network. Operators stood under the assumption that anything that flew could be seen, measured, and if needed, eliminated. Quote number 1. Noise is for amateurs. We see everything. In weekly readiness exercises, officers simulated jamming attacks from hypothetical American squadrons. The answer was always the same: crank the gain, switch frequencies, power through. Soviet systems used sheer output strength over 20 megawatts in some fixed-array installations to burn through interference. Quote number 2. No aircraft can hide. They can only run. In this room, the technology was not just equipment. It was an extension of the state. Massive P-14 Tall King VHF radars stretched over 30 meters wide. Daryl U early warning arrays pierced the atmosphere. Even mobile Buck and S-200 systems carried tracking protocols based on clean electromagnetic returns. Credential drop number 1. In 1986, General Alexander Maslov, Chief of Radar Forces, told the Defense Council, "Our systems operate in clarity. There is no such thing as a disappearing object. Western stealth programs were mocked. U.S. electronic warfare dismissed as circus tricks." Quote number 3. The Americans create illusions. We create firepower. The radar engineers wrote manuals filled with charts, how to differentiate spoofed targets from real ones, how to isolate jamming pulses, how to counter false signals. But every one of those instructions relied on a single assumption that the radar would at least see something. They were prepared for interference. They were prepared for signal saturation. They were not prepared for meaningless visibility, where radar returned noise that passed every system check, yet told them nothing at all. No officer in that room, surrounded by blinking lights and steel confidence, believed the impossible that detection itself had become a vulnerability, that the act of seeing no longer meant knowing. It would take exactly 2 minutes of noise to shatter 30 years of certainty. And no one in that room saw it coming. The Soviet radar doctrine wasn't just a technical framework, it was a world view, forged in the late 1940s, hardened by Korean War dogfights and reinforced by decades of continental defense planning. It assumed one foundational truth: if energy returns to the dish, an object caused it. Soviet radar systems were calibrated not only for detection, but for classification by reflection strengths. The larger the return, the bigger the object, the sharper the edge, the faster the movement. It was physics, pure and untouchable. Their systems focused on high output, fixed frequency beams, radiating immense power over broad air corridors. The guiding belief was simple: overpower the sky. If an adversary tried to jam, Soviet systems would detect the interference and triangulate its source. If stealth was attempted, radar would rely on sideband harmonics to catch the hidden object. Quote from 1978 Radar Training Manual. The echo may be weak, but it is always real. Credential drop number 2 Colonel Yuri Novikov, one of the architects of the PVO's early warning protocols, wrote in 1981, "Even with jamming, our filters restore truth. Signal strength is proof." This doctrine shaped everything hardware design focused on fixed arrays with maximum output. Signal processors relied on analog filtering, expecting predictable distortions. Operators were taught to reconstruct clean targets from dirty input. This wasn't arrogance, it was logic hardened by decades of success. Soviet radars had tracked American SR-71s, high-altitude balloons, U-2 flights, and NATO bombers for years. They believed no system in the world could fully erase a radar return. And then came the noise. What appeared over Kaliningrad wasn't traditional jamming. There was no signal flood, no power spike, no frequency denial. Instead, valid targets simply lost coherence. The radar received full signal strength but could no longer interpret it. The shapes blurred. The IFF signatures collapsed. What was once a flying object now looked like meaningless chaos. It wasn't signal denial. It was semantic corruption. And the doctrine had no defense for that. Every Soviet radar system was built to fight through interference, not ambiguity. Their war machines expected physics. They received deception, fatal assumption. Soviet engineers believed no one could manipulate radar signals into passing through their filters without carrying real information. That assumption held true for 40 years until the filters themselves became the target. 01-14. 14 high-speed targets appear on Kaliningrad's main scope, vectoring from the Baltic at 870 counter-commodor H. 01-15. Target 7 flickers. Return strength fluctuates. 01-15-22. Target 12 vanishes completely. 01-15-30. Volodin issues local override, switching radar to alternate beam mode. 01-15-37. Static overlays primary return lanes. 01-16. Full contact loss across all targets. 01-16-08. Met backup system activates. IFF handshake receives only randomized pulses. 01-16-40. Operators report incoherent response patterns. 01-17, Minsk relay station confirms identical pattern, no radar blackout, but total target corruption. 01-17-45. Third site in western Belarus joins the call. Ghosting confirmed. Visual data contradicts radar feed. 01-18. Volodin locks out filter set and drops output power. Suspecting overload. 01-18-33. Screen flattens into a horizon of grain, no lines, no echoes, only noise. 01-19. Interference spreads laterally across sector bandwidth. 01-20. Attempted signal isolation returns malformed echoes with random velocity vectors. 01-20-41. Technician reports radar logic thinks clouds are aircraft. 01-21. Shutdown ordered to prevent cascade into guidance systems. The event lasted just under 7 minutes. In that time, 6 radar sites reported simultaneous target loss. 4 SAM units went offline due to invalid acquisition data, and no interceptors were scrambled not because of uncertainty, but because the enemy had simply vanished from logic. Credential drop number 3. Kaliningrad Command's after-action report read, "Target loss occurred under nominal system load. Filters received valid data structures but failed to identify or restore coherent objects. No hostile jamming signature detected." The most chilling detail, the system didn't fail. It ran perfectly. The processors received valid waveform packets, structured exactly like real echoes. Every sensor pinged, every antenna pulsed, but none of it made sense. This was not disruption. It was deception so complete. It bypassed detection and attacked cognition. Quote from Volodin's debrief, "We didn't lose signal. We lost meaning. Operators rebooted systems twice, switched frequencies, ran diagnostics. The systems passed every check, but the sky remained blank, not black, just filled with movement that could not be recognized. It was a new kind of invisibility, not hiding the object, hiding what the object is. For 40 years, Soviet radar had focused on finding echoes. But now, they were hunting phantoms deliberate, designed, synthetic ghosts. And their war machines weren't trained for ghosts. By 0600 that same morning, reports from Kaliningrad, Minsk, and the Baltic Fleet's radar command were relayed to Air Defense Central Command in Moscow. The summary was stark, full-spectrum target loss, system-wide semantic corruption, no confirmed jamming source. It should have triggered a top-level crisis meeting. It didn't. Instead, the response was procedural dismissal, wrapped in ideological certainty. Dismissal number 1, operator error. Senior command attributed the anomaly to manual filter misconfiguration. Kaliningrad's technicians were blamed for setting the wrong signal rejection thresholds. This implied the targets were there, but the operators tuned them out. Quote from HQ dispatch, "Deviation from standard pulse logic, likely cause of false visibility drop. Dismissal number 2, atmospheric anomaly." A second theory was weather interference, a passing thermal inversion, they argued, may have distorted signal reflection angles. Quote from meteorological liaison, "Inverted layers over the Baltic may have produced anomalous scatter." Dismissal number 3, Western signal decoys. A more politically palatable explanation blamed NATO. A decoy operation involving radar-absorbent drones or standoff jamming may have been used to simulate ghosting. Quote from Air Doctrine, Division, "Enemy deception unlikely to affect multiple sectors simultaneously. Possibly a test run." Each explanation served a purpose-shift blame. Preserve confidence, avoid reevaluation. Credential drop number 4. The KGB's Electronic Surveillance Directorate issued a one-line verdict. Noise injection occurred but lacked disruptive capability. Attribution inconclusive. Threat level low. The flaw was not in equipment. It was in perception. High Command could not accept that an unknown method had rendered their entire system blind, not because of signal loss, but because the system couldn't tell real from false. To admit that was to admit vulnerability at the core of Soviet defense strategy, so the event was minimized, reframed, buried. Instead of emergency protocol, the engineers were sent revised calibration procedures. Instead of strategic review, the radar technicians were told to adjust gain margins. Instead of investigation, the incident was renamed Kaliningrad Echo Aberration. Quote from internal memo, "No further action required. System integrity remains uncompromised." But the operators knew better. They had seen it. Seen the moment when the sky turned into noise, seen the radar betray its own logic. And the worst part, they were now ordered to act like it hadn't happened. Because in the Soviet system, nothing was more dangerous than a truth that Doctrine couldn't process. The engineers at the Radiotechnical Institute were the first to respond. Presented with the Kaliningrad Echo Aberration Report, they sought an explanation within the framework they trusted wave theory and hardware response. Within weeks, they released a solution that sounded both technical and reassuring. They proposed that the incident had been caused by phase coherence, collapse, a condition in which overlapping signal returns become misaligned due to abnormal beam pattern interference. The proposed fix reconfigure radar filters using rotating phase discrimination to isolate clean signal structures. On paper, it made sense. Soviet radar systems used fixed phase arrays. Introducing dynamic phase filters could theoretically allow the system to reject non-linear returns, restoring target visibility through pattern matching. Quote from proposed fixed documentation, "Dynamic filtering reintroduces clarity by rejecting parasitic phase structures. The design was elegant, mathematical, optimistic, and completely wrong." Why it seemed plausible? It addressed signal distortion without blaming core systems. It promised results through software, not costly hardware rebuilds. It maintained the illusion that the radar grid was fundamentally sound. Why it failed? The noise returns weren't misaligned, they were designed to pass filters. The interference wasn't from nature, it was structured deception, not chaos. The proposed filter upgrades assumed the enemy was overwhelming the signal, not outthinking the processor. Credential drop number 5. A classified 1988 performance report stated, phase discrimination filters showed no improvement in target reacquisition during test simulations, but the report was shelved. The theory remained policy. Instead of addressing the logic flaw at the core of their system, trusting signal structure over source verification, Soviet command doubled down on refinements. They ordered reprogramming of local radar filters. They installed upgraded oscillators. They issued new operator manuals. None of it changed the outcome because the Americans weren't jamming Soviet radar. They were feeding it lies that passed every truth test. The rotating phase filters couldn't reject what the radar believed was real. This was not a signal war. It was a war of meaning. And the Soviet solution only deepened their commitment to misunderstanding. With the rotating phase filter upgrade proving ineffective, Soviet theorists turned toward a more exotic explanation, environmental hijacking, spearheaded by a faction within the Radiophysics Institute. This theory posited that the radar ghosting wasn't purely electronic but atmospheric. They blamed atmospheric refraction inversion or even signal parallax anomalies caused by ionospheric conditions. It was a solution born of desperation, not data. Theory American systems had learned to exploit naturally occurring upper atmosphere reflections to inject false returns by bouncing signals off inversion layers or using passive relay mechanisms. Enemy aircraft could make radar pulses bend, scatter, or reappear out of phase and out of context. Quote from white paper, reflected returns may mimic structured pulses when processed through vertically variant air columns. Credential drop number 6. In a 1988 defense symposium, the lead author presented atmospheric multipath reflection and enemy echo cloning as a candidate for the Kaliningrad anomaly. Why it seemed plausible. It matched observable symptom structured returns that weren't real. It shifted the burden of failure onto nature, not the system. It preserved the core radar logic returns still equaled objects. Why it failed. The anomaly occurred simultaneously across multiple regions with different weather patterns. There was no visual confirmation, no contrails, no aircraft, No sonic evidence. Western platforms were never in range of any known inversion layer-based relay system. In response, Soviet engineers attempted to build atmospheric compensation algorithms designed to filter suspected multipath reflections by triangulating angular inconsistencies. But these systems required perfect environmental data and nanosecond timing resolution that Soviet analog processors simply couldn't deliver. Infighting erupts. Military planners accused academic scientists of chasing ghosts. The GRU insisted the anomaly was man-made, not environmental. Defense committee meetings devolved into ideological gridlock. In a closed session, one colonel shouted, "The sky is not to blame. The enemy is." But without hard proof, the environmental explanation was easier to accept. It absolved the system. It avoided a doctrinal reckoning. It let Moscow pretend that nature, not NATO, was responsible. By late 1988, no consensus existed. Two false solutions, rotating filters and atmospheric hijacking, battled for dominance. Both had their champions. Both had their paperwork. And both were wrong because the Americans weren't reflecting Soviet radar. They were rewriting its logic from the outside. Final quote from internal GRU memo. "The problem is not what we see. The problem is that we trust what we see." But even that realization would come too late. After the second wave of radar anomalies swept through Kaliningrad, Minsk, and the Black Sea region in early 1988, the GRU launched a formal intelligence recovery operation under the codename VeilNet. Its mandate was to reconstruct the event from all available signals intelligence, telemetry, and visual confirmation logs. What they found was not clarity, but collapse. Failure number 1, data gaps. Raw data from the radar sites arrived corrupted. The primary Kaliningrad station had overwritten its loop buffer less than 12 hours after the event standard operating procedure for routine traffic. Backup logs contained timestamps, but no waveform archives. In some cases, the files weren't blank, they were too large. One 42-minute radar capture log was 3.7 gigabytes, several orders of magnitude above expected values. Analysts couldn't open it. Soviet systems weren't designed for that kind of data. Failure number 2, intelligence compartmentalization. KGB signals units operated independently of GRU field analysis. The Radiotechnical Committee overseeing early warning systems refused to share software architecture, citing classification tiers. Field investigators were told to analyze output, not system logic. No one saw the whole picture. Quote from an internal report: "Each node reviewed its own signal. No one reviewed the system." Failure number 3, the phantom signal. In at least 3 cases, radar logs showed a return signal that perfectly matched known American aircraft, but with impossible flight characteristics. One object appeared to reverse direction at Mach 2 without deceleration. Another split into 4 signals without losing coherence. GRU cryptographic teams investigated spoofing. They found nothing because the signals weren't fake. They were recorded echoes of past flights, replayed in real time with altered vectors. Credential drop number 7. An unreleased 1988 SIGINT analysis concluded, "We received valid echoes from events that had not occurred." Failure number 4, source unknown. The Americans weren't using brute force jamming. That much was clear, but VeilNet couldn't determine what platform had injected the false signals. There were no known aircraft close enough. Satellites were ruled out. Ground-based emitters required line of sight. Analysts were left with a terrifying possibility. The enemy didn't have to be nearby. They didn't need to overpower Soviet radars. They only needed to speak its language. And that language waveform structure, return logic. Filter response had never been classified. It had been published in decades of radar journals, training guides, and defense exhibitions. The Americans had studied the grammar of Soviet detection. Now they were rewriting the sentences. Final KGB quote. The attack was real. The method was invisible. And our doctrine has no translation. This was no longer electronic warfare. It was linguistic sabotage of machine perception. And for Soviet intelligence, the blackout wasn't just in power, it was in understanding. For decades, Soviet engineers viewed radar as an equation signal out. Signal back, target found. Their doctrine assumed all deception required power, brute force jamming, distortion through sheer noise, but in the American playbook, power was irrelevant. What mattered was precision of manipulation. By the mid-1980s, 5 breakthrough technologies converged into a single strategic capability. The Soviets never anticipated the ability to control what an enemy radar believes. Technology number 1, digital radio frequency memory, DRFM. The Soviets expected analog interference. Instead, they faced playback. American aircraft, like the EA-6B Prowler, carried DRFM systems that recorded radar pulses in real time, stored them, then re-emitted them with microsecond delays and altered return signatures. The radar wasn't being jammed, it was being fed false memories. The Soviet system thought it was seeing genuine aircraft, moving as they always had, but with logic-defying movements or vanishing profiles. Progressive score, Soviet expectation, static signal paths, analog logic, American reality dynamic, digital echoes, programmable deception. Effect radar saw what the Americans wanted it to see. Technology number 2, frequency agility. Soviet radars operated on fixed or narrowband frequency ranges. The Americans deployed airborne systems with frequency hopping capabilities that changed pulse parameters thousands of times per second. Soviet filters were overwhelmed not by volume, but by chameleon behavior. They couldn't lock onto a moving target if the signature changed before the filter completed its loop. Credential drop number 8. A declassified U.S. Navy report from 1991 stated, Soviet radars can't follow a target that won't stay still on the spectrum. Technology number 3, stealth, shaping, and signal disruption. The F-117 wasn't just invisible by design. Its services scattered radar energy in mathematically unpredictable directions, creating echoes that looked like atmospheric clutter. Coupled with DRFM and frequency agility, the aircraft didn't just vanish, it became a source of noise injection. Radars would see objects, but those objects had no identifiable shape or vector. They couldn't be tracked because they didn't stay objects. Technology. Number 4, standoff, electronic attack. The Americans realized they didn't need to be close. High-power standoff jammers like the EF-111A Raven operated beyond Soviet missile range, flooding radar receivers with deceptive signals shaped to mimic real targets. But more importantly, they used time delay DRFM bursts that introduced false altitude and speed data, corrupting entire fire control systems. Technology number 5, network-centric sensor fusion. While the Soviets relied on isolated radar stations, the Americans built a shared intelligence web. AWACS aircraft, satellites, SIGINT, and airborne jammers worked in tandem. One node fed false data, another confirmed deception, and a third mapped Soviet reactions in real time. Soviet expectation, a single source, gives a single truth. American reality, every source is a tool. Every sensor a weapon, combat result the enemy sees, but never understands combat. Example 1987 simulated penetration exercise, EA-6Bs launched from the North Sea. AWACS guided deception zones from 300 kilometers away. F-111As injected synthetic targets over the Baltic. Kaliningrad radar grid collapsed into white noise in under 4 minutes. No Soviet radar reacquired target. No Soviet missile launched. Final quote from U.S. Doctrine Manual, 1992. If the enemy cannot trust what they see, they cannot shoot. The Americans didn't blind Soviet radar. They made it see ghosts. They didn't jam the system. They convinced it to jam itself. And by 1987, that revolution was complete. 0344 hours. Baltic Sea, simulated strike run. AWACS commands active. 0345 EA-6Bs begins signal injection. Radar returns multiply 17 phantom targets. Bloom. 346. Soviet P-14 radars attempt frequency shift. Phantom echoes adjust to match. 0347. Target 4 breaks into 2, then 4, then 8. None hold trajectory. 0348. S-200 missile crews receive targeting data. Radar lock fails. Returns don't stabilize. 0349. Backup station reports aircraft heading due east. 1 minute later, target reverses direction at Mach 1. 0350. SAM command halts launch authorization. No trackable targets remain. 0351 visual spotters report no contrails, no sound, no confirmation. 0352. All screens show white noise horizon. No vectors, no object ID. 0353. Communications scrambled to coordinate radar handover. Secondary sites report same ghosting. 0355. Air Defense Command deems the event non-operational and suspends further action. Score American aircraft penetration. Total Soviet radar acquisition. 0 Soviet missile launches. 0 electronic kill ratio. 100% time to radar collapse. 9 minutes. The Kaliningrad event, once dismissed as a fluke, became undeniable. NATO aircraft had staged a full incursion against one of the most heavily defended radar grids in the world, and the system had seen nothing real. Reversal quotes from Section 2. Mockery. They said noise meant confusion, but confusion became the weapon. They said stealth was fantasy, but they fired at clouds and missed. They said the Americans would run. Instead, they vanished. They said jamming could degrade. They didn't expect it to erase. Commanders at every level faced the same realization. Their filters had not been bypassed. They had been used against them. Credential drop to 9. In a classified 1988 PVO after-action review, one line stood alone. The radar system functioned perfectly. That was the problem. The Americans didn't exploit Soviet failures. They exploited Soviet success, tuning their deceptions to pass through every layer of Soviet logic. No missile had been fired, no base destroyed, no territory lost. But a system that had taken 40 years to build a network of satellites, radars, algorithms, and protocols had been neutralized in under 10 minutes, and no one inside the USSR had a fix. Final combat summary. Targets acquired 0. Missiles fired 0. Battle duration 9 minutes. Radar credibility destroyed. Doctrinal integrity shattered. Last quote from General Maslov, previously dismissive. They didn't blind us. They taught our systems to lie to us. In the weeks following the total collapse of the Kaliningrad radar grid, a classified internal review began inside the Soviet Air Defense Command. Unlike earlier dismissals or deflections, this meeting was different. It included not only radar engineers, but systems theorists, communications officers, mathematicians, and for the first time, behavioral analysts. What emerged was not just a list of failures. It was a paradigm shift. The central realization: the enemy had not attacked the hardware. They had attacked the assumptions. Failure number 1, information, versus mass Soviet systems, were built on output more power, more range, more coverage. But the Americans didn't add power. They added information manipulation. They injected meaning into signals that weren't there, creating a tactical advantage from informational deception, not kinetic superiority. Paraphrased, Soviet quote, they built weapons to transmit power. We built weapons to interpret it. Failure number 2, precision versus quantity. Soviet doctrine emphasized coverage, mass detection, wide sweep, overlapping zones. USICA systems focused on precision, a single plane perfectly hidden, a single signal perfectly shaped. They didn't try to outnumber Soviet systems. They tried to outthink them. Failure number 3, computing versus manpower. The Americans leaned on digital processors, real-time feedback loops, and machine-driven deception. The Soviets still depended on analog filtering and human interpretation. But in a 5-second deception window, a processor always wins. Quote from review panel, "Our systems cannot decide faster than they can interpret. Theirs don't interpret. They decide." Failure number 4, systems versus objects. Soviet planners saw threats as objects, planes, missiles, signatures, but the Americans attacked systems, the connections between sensors, filters, commands. The jamming wasn't against the radar, it was against how radar and missiles and protocols interacted. Credential drop, Chapter 10. A buried 1989 military science paper concluded Soviet air defense assumed detection and response were linear. The American model proved them recursive. The revelation wasn't just tactical, it was ideological. The Soviet system was built on clarity, on the belief that enough power and control could eliminate uncertainty. But the battlefield had shifted. The Americans weren't hiding objects. They were creating interpretations, feeding Soviet sensors what they expected to see, then changing the meaning before the data could reach the operator. The machines failed not because they were broken. They failed because they worked exactly as designed on the wrong assumptions. Final Soviet reflection. Our filters passed the test. The test was wrong. This wasn't a technical defeat. It was the collapse of a worldview. At an abandoned radar facility outside Kaliningrad, one console still stands upright, its screen dark, its wiring long stripped, its frame rusted by sea winds. On its side, etched by a forgotten technician's knife, are 3 words in Cyrillic, "We saw nothing." That console was not just a terminal. It was proof that a system designed to never miss could be fooled by its own perfection. The Soviets built machines to see everything. They ended up watching ghosts. This wasn't jamming. It was subversion of meaning, not the destruction of sensors, but the manipulation of trust. The radar was not just a device. It was the mirror of Soviet faith in control, and the Americans cracked the mirror without ever touching it. The Kaliningrad event is barely mentioned in Cold War archives. No missiles were launched, no bases bombed, no cities destroyed. But that silence hides the most profound lesson of the era. The enemy doesn't need to blind you. They only need to convince you that what you see is real when it isn't. For Soviet Radar Command, that night rewrote the rules of war, not through force, but through logic. Final image. A rusted radar dish pointed skyward, locked in place, seeing nothing. It was not just a radar failure. It was a system realizing it could no longer understand its own senses. Proof that in the end, the Cold War wasn't won by hiding, but by speaking in a language only the enemy's machines could understand. Final line. The Cold War wasn't won with missiles. It was won with echoes, algorithms, and illusions the Soviet Union never saw coming.